alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to Alive After Reading. I'm your host, Tim Niederreiter, and this is the first episode of Season 4 of Alive After Reading, because this is episode 301 of the podcast, which I don't normally remember to say. Maybe that's gonna be the theme of this new season, so I remember the name of the number of the episode, but I wouldn't count on it. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. We've got a guest for you, as always. Stephanie Ellis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Tim. So, talking earlier, it's a bit late at this time of night, but I'm staying up because this is the world of dark fiction and horror, and I like to talk about that. I am actually a writer of a variety of horror. I do folk horror. I've recently had Reborn has just come out with Bridget's Gate Press. It's the sequel to The Five Turns of the Wheel, which was out, I keep thinking it's last year, but it's a couple of years ago now. And I've also got a collection of short stories set in the same world as The Wheel Turns. I've done a short bio-horror novella, Paused. It's about a condition that you wouldn't really want to have yourself if you've ever heard of locked in, locked out syndrome.
Oh, yeah.
Your body is seized and your mind's there. That's pretty much.
Ooh.
There's gothic novella, Bottled. I also do dark poetry. I've written a found poetry collection with horror writer Cindy O'Quinn, Foundlings, that was out this year. Found poetry based on metal lyrics because I.
Oh, now you're speaking my language.
I had to analyse about 200 lyrics to create 100 poems, original poems, and that was tough going when you actually look at the words within those lyrics. So it was really hard. And I've got a folk horror coming out next year, The Woodcutter in the summer. That's not a Five Turns like folk horror, one. And I've currently got a gothic novella that's trying to find a home at the moment. It's sort of Victorian, East End of London, set against a Ripper backdrop, but it's not Jack the Ripper. So I do write a variety of horror, but my main thing is folk horror, a bit of gothic. I have got some dystopian work, but that's not out yet. But I do hope to see that out in the next couple of years. And yet, dark poetry. And a separate side is I'm also over at Horror Tree. If people use that resource at all for submission calls or for writing, because I used to edit the online zine there, Trembling with Fear. I did that for about 5 years. But now I'm still there, not as that editor, but I do the indie bookshelf release post each week. So if anybody who's listening to this is a writer and an indie writer, a small press, self-published, and they want a little bit of free promo, then they just send the book details to me and I put it on the bookshelves and it stays there for quite a while.
Well, sweet. People should check that out, especially, if I know there's some. I'm friends with a fair number of horror authors. I'm not sure how many of them actually listen to this show, but yeah, no, that sounds really useful. I wish I wrote horror now.
It's called horrortree.com. It's Stuart Conover's site. And it's the one regret he says that he has is that name, because yes, there's horror there, but it's very much speculative fiction from sci-fi to fantasy. It's that whole range, as long as there's a dark element, but even stuff that isn't necessarily dark creeps in, as well. It's not extreme stuff.
Well, then I'll have to check that out too, because that sounds really interesting, really useful, actually, to have a little bit of promotion and that kind of thing. And also it just sounds like an interesting site in general. I've never gone there before, but I'm going to have to make it a destination.
Interviews, blogs, guest posts, reviews. As I say, submission calls from a variety of publishers. They regularly do new ones. There's quite a team of people working there. They're all volunteers, and I've been there quite a few years, and Stuart puts a lot of work into it. So I would say visit it. It's worth a visit, and it's all for the writers and the readers.
Awesome. So I want to go back to something else you mentioned in your introduction there, which is your found poetry. That sounds so interesting. I love found poetry. I've done some found poetry myself, not a ton. And I've also tried to make metal lyrics out of classic literature, because I don't perform metal or any of that stuff, but I love heavy metal and death metal and all that kind of thing. And I can imagine And I did make basically a lyric. It was out of James Joyce, the end of the last few paragraphs of The Dead. That short story. I'm like, oh yeah, let's go. And it's actually kind of perfect. That was a really easy one because it's such a bleak ending. Yeah,
I like found poetry's great because it's like a puzzle. You've only got certain words, and to come up with something new, it's a real challenge, and you're not struggling for. Yeah, you're trying to find an idea or a theme, but because you're restricted, you're not there faffing around for ages trying to come up with something. It sort of presents itself. When I look at the words, as soon as I can get two that connect together, then everything else seems to naturally follow, and you can build up from that. As long as you can find those two to form a basis, and then I build up around it, and that always seems to work. I think it was a few years ago now. I was writing poetry, and I found they did a found poetry month during National Poetry Month. There's a journal, and it's found poetry the whole month, and they would come up with a different challenge each day. And I thought, oh, I'll have a go at this, and I really enjoyed it. And I just did little bits over the years, and then this past year I was working with Cindy O'Quinn, and we picked up Linda D. Addison's and Alessandro Manzetti's work, because we're both fans of them as dark poets. And I was reading Whitechapel Rhapsody, and I know Cindy was reading Linda's work. And so we both did found poems each. Cindy did Linda's, I did Alessandro's, and then we combined as well and worked that way, like Linda and Alessandro had done themselves. And the two of them actually wrote the foreword to the book, and which we were really pleased about. And it's quite a special book. It just works so well.
Oh, that's incredible. So you got the original authors to tune into your frequency as well. That's awesome.
Yeah, it just seemed to work. There was no real issue, and I'd send some words over to Cindy, and then she'd send them back, and it just felt as though it was a natural process, and there was no effort. There was no, oh, we've got to change these words, we've got to do that. It just seemed to come together. Cindy calls it magical, and I'd agree on that. It just worked so well. And and with writing too. I mean, any writing can feel kind of magical when it works, but it can be tough as well when it's. Yeah, I mean, I've been going through a tough year of writing myself, so it's been. I mean, a lack of writing really is the upshot of it. I think with the lack of writing, sometimes it's time and life pressures and everything else, because it's been so difficult the past few years, and people are having to adapt to whatever's gone on around them, and it's brought stresses that we've never really been through before. I mean, in my own case, we lived down south south of England, and decided to move to be nearer to family, to be a bit more rural, and for me to be able to write more. And yes, I have written more, but I've also taken on formatting and editing work and everything else. So all that free time you think you'll have to do your own writing doesn't actually materialise. It's like when you tidy the house and you make space, and then suddenly everything fills it all up again. It's a bit like that. But I have managed to get some books done and some other projects, and so there is time, but it is really difficult regardless of where you're at.
Well, you sound like you're pretty prolific, actually. I mean, what are you working on right now, if you don't mind me asking?
There's a couple of things. Out today, actually, was a book. It's another poetry book, and that was with Shane Douglas Keane, called Lilith Rising, and that's a novella in verse form. We are working on something else now, which I'm not really saying, but it is a novella type thing in verse form again, so we've got that one going. I'm working on a new novel. I'm at just over 50,000 words, called Women of the Witch Eye. And that is a slight departure from me. It's dark fiction, but I wanted to move a bit more to the more mainstream, and it's set in 1649 and the English Civil War. And I wanted to write about that period of time because I've done my family history, and some of my family from that time in Lancashire were the earliest or the first Quakers. And so I've brought their names into it. So I've got Civil War going on. I've got these women that are suspected of witchcraft, and there's all sorts of dark. It's very much is something happening or isn't it? Is it just people, superstitions?
Oh, yeah.
But I am doing a lot of research into that time, looking at the battles that were fought there. There are some of the witches that it was the daughter of the witches who were tried during the Pendle witch trials over here in, I'm going to say 1612, but I probably got the year wrong, but around that time, the daughter of these women who were accused of witchcraft, she actually accused them. It was her mother and her grandmother, and she accused them, and she wasn't tried or anything. She was freed. But then in the mid 1630s or early 1630s, she was actually accused again by somebody else, and again she was freed. But I've brought her back in to this story with the person who accused her, and there's all sorts of little bits of revenge going on there against the backdrop of, as I say, a very disturbed county, a very difficult time. I'm having a lot of fun with it because I want to get up to, I'm going to say 90,000. I like doorstep books. I like really thick books. 5 Turns of the Wheel and Reborn, they're about 70,000 each. But I do like to read a really long story. And I thought, right, I'll see if I can do one. And this one is just creating, as I get to a bit, I think, can I make it last? But something else adds in. Because I don't plan. I don't know about you. I'm not.
Yeah, I don't plan either. I'm not much of a planner.
Yeah, I'm a pantser completely. So as I write, story evolves, and I never really know how it's going to end until about 2/3 of the way through. The ending will suddenly come to me, and then I'm on the final run. But I got to about 50k the other day, and then this woman who had just been in the background, she suddenly appeared on the scene, and she's under a different name. She's not supposed to be there, and I thought, oh yeah, okay, so this is going to go on. But I've got lots of kids that just introduce themselves. I've tried to plot in the very, very early days. You'd hear of people who'd describe their characters and they'd do the backstories and everything else before they get into it. But I can't do that. I try, and it just feels too restrictive.
Yeah.
So I start off with a character, and I see them somewhere, and I think, right, what's going to happen? And then I'm just in their heads, and I'm just walking the road, and things happen. It's natural. Any other way, I'm not saying never. It might happen one day, but any other way just seems unnatural to me. I just see what happens.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I've been trying to do some outlining lately, but it's so difficult for me to stay on target. That's why when I was growing up, when I started writing when I was a teenager, I would try to outline a little bit here and there. And I think my most successful outline was the beginning of my book, Orphan Mage, which is, a high fantasy book. And that one ended up being about 100,000 words long. But my longest book was 170,000 words long. And that one is, I did kind of outline it because I came up with all these places they were going to go in the story. And then I was like, okay, I'll go through here. And this is where they'll end up. But then, and I knew there was going to be a sequence of traveling to these different places. And that was kind of the loosest outline I could come up with.
Yeah.
At the time.
Yeah, I always find that I'm making note. I write it and then I'll have to go back and make a note. I've got a little notebook for this one. So I'm writing down the names of the people and the villages and things like that, because I'm partway through and then suddenly you can't remember somebody's name or what their eye colour might have been, and I'll go back and make another note of that. And there's real historical characters in there. So if I'm talking about Cromwell, I'm trying to find out what colour his eyes were, or John Milton's in there as well. He's actually
I was going to say, you got John Milton in there if you want.
Yeah, he's the main character, actually.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah, it was just after Charles I was executed, and Cromwell, when Charles was executed, a pamphlet was produced that sort of defended Charles's position, and then Milton had to write a sort of riposte to that to show that the king wasn't as good as he tried to make out. So it's that period of time when he's trying to put the words that show his feelings for the king, that the king wasn't this good guy that he's trying to make himself out to be. So Milton's there, but it's also investigating the state of the army and various accusations.
Wow, this sounds like it's going to have a lot of depth to it. It sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I didn't realise, but when I was reading about Milton, he'd married a girl or a woman from this royalist family, and they were together a couple of months, and then she left. for about 2 years.
Wow.
And then she came back. And
okay.
I can't
weird.
find out much about what she did in that time. They think it's because she was a royalist family.
So she went and hid, or
it's all that time.
Family, yeah.
Yeah, but during that time, he was actually had a relationship with another woman and was writing tracts for divorce to allow people to get divorced.
Wow. Oh man,
that
he would be
either.
doing that, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. But this mysterious woman that no one's ever named, I've actually brought her into it, and she's suddenly appeared, and she's going to try and disrupt things. So it's a lot of fun. You know, you can use history and then turn it around a little bit, and I'll make that clear that some things are real, but then I've played around with it a lot, which I think maybe some films and television programs could actually admit to a bit more, rather than implying that this is the truth, which a lot of people believe. It's
absolutely
not. Yeah.
Kind of like is it the TV show Rome on HBO? I'm a big fan of that one. I really liked that one.
I haven't seen that.
But because the main characters in the show, there's two main characters that aren't historical, and but they kind of are. Is the funny part, because they're just named a couple. They're these two guys who were named in Julius Caesar's memoir of the Gallic Wars.
Yeah.
But then they're not really important to anything else, and they just kind of go through this whole historical period, and the Civil War and everything with Caesar and everything, and it's really interesting because they're just like they're there for everything that's important, but nobody remembers them in history. Is kind of the gist of the idea of the show, in a way.
Yeah.
So
I was reading a book recently, Robert Harris's Act of Oblivion, and it's about somebody who goes chasing after the regicides, the people who killed Charles I. And there's two that went over to America, Colonels Wally and Goff. And he's got this fictional character, but he's doing all the things, he's trying to chase these real people.
Wow.
And find them. So I say it's great to find a bit of history that you can use. Because history was a love of mine. I thought, right, I'd love to bring it into the dark fiction side. When I do the Gothic, it tends to be the Whitechapel, East End of London area, and that's partly because I also had family who were in that area at the time, and they were amongst the poorest people, and I thought it's a way of exploring that aspect of history as well as the Gothic area that I write. If I read Gothic literature, there's a lot of, you see a lot of it's always set in mansions, and they're always well off, and I prefer to look at those who are poor, their lives. So I'm in the workhouses and the hospitals for the poor and on the streets and seeing what's happening there.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And it's true that you never see. I mean, like you don't often see a Gothic story about people who are not well off to some extent, or or who aren't at least in a mansion, like you say. I mean, was it Jane Eyre and a lot of those other ones? Like yeah, sure. Yeah. A lot of these characters aren't rich, but then they live in a rich person's house.
Or it's a member of the family or someone who's fallen on the hard times, and they go to the rich person's house.
Yeah,
but I just find the characters a lot more fascinating because they had on the streets, because they've got such tough lives and the jobs they had to do and how they had to survive. And I think you can bring in a little bit more of a creepy aspect to that than in some of the mansions, because I think those sides with the well-off, it's been not done to death, but it's expected. It's time for something different now, and that's the way I like to go with those.
Oh, that's really interesting. But I want to, and it sounds again like you may go dark, you may have a dark side to your fiction, but it sounds like you go all over the place. Actually, it sounds like you explore a lot of different themes, especially historically, though.
That's the history side and the Gothic. But I haven't really done too much. This is me moving into that area a little bit.
Have you done? So, are your other books contemporary or secondary world or something in between?
The folk horror ones, a few people have read it, and it took them a little while to realise that they are actually sort of now-ish.
Okay.
Because it is set in the present day, but with a sort of parallel world just beyond the veil, I call it. So there's sort of human creatures there, but that particular area is very much playing upon my own childhood growing up in Shropshire, which is a rural county over here, and I lived in a pub which is in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't even in a village. I'd have to go 5 miles to school one way for primary school when I was, small, 10 miles the other way to my secondary school. And that would usually involve a walk of about a mile and on deserted lanes to the bus stop. And there would be the farmers were our regulars. And so the pub that's in the Five Turns is based on the cider house, which is where I grew up. Some of the regulars in the pub, they're there in disguised form. But it was a way of exploring countryside. There's a sort of nostalgia trip, I think it was a little bit for me going back there. But it was also, I really enjoyed folk horror, and I talk about the Wicker Man occasionally, but what influenced me from that is the scene where they have the mummers troops, where you have the half man, half woman hobby horse as they go up to during that parade up to the Wicker Man. It was those characters because they can look really sinister, and if you look in some of the images of traditional English folk traditions, they look really creepy. And I wanted to bring that into it, so I brought that into the story, and there's some personal aspects in there as well, but it's very much a way of trying to restore the balance in nature, because these people who are a mummer's troop, but they are sort of supernatural beings in a way, Tommy, Betty and Fiddler, they're sons of Mother Nature, and they've been allowed to rule in this area for a while, but they've become too cruel in their rituals. Too much death is happening. So it's how they're dealt with. But over that story and Reborn, which follows, it's me trying to get a balance between what people want nature to be, because if you go out from the town, they expect the countryside to be pretty and everything to be sort of fluffy lambs and whatever, but there's cruelty in nature as well. And you will never be able to get rid of that. So I think there's got to be a bit of respect both sides. So you go out into the countryside, it's a working environment, and nature is cruel. You can't just treat it like a play park or a day out at a pleasure park or something like that. I was trying to bring that aspect back into it as well. So there's all sorts of different things in there, but set against the backdrop of ritual over a year, and the rituals involved obviously loss of life from the villagers to keep these other creatures going because they need blood to survive. But it was like a parasitic relationship.
Right.
And then as I was thinking about this today, when people say, what themes are in your books, it's also about control, because in these stories, the women of the villages, they're the ones who tend to suffer most. They might lose their child, they might lose their husband when they get older and the age of the crone, then they're killed. So they are out of control of their lives. So when this one woman, Megan, she makes a stand, and her mother, they both live actually at the Five Turns pub. Their way of trying to re-establish control over their lives as well. And I think there's an element in today's society where a lot of us feel out of control. We can't, nobody listens to us, so I was exploring that a little bit in the story of these women whose lives have been ruled by men or by these male beings, and they're trying to bring back their own, get their voices heard. It might work. In some instances it works. In others they lose their lives, but it's because they chose it rather than because they were told they had to do certain things.
That's fascinating. And it does remind me of some of my own proclivities for dystopian fantasy, which is kind of what I'm leaning toward now as the term. Because there's this oppressive culture that exists throughout history in a lot of ways. Not to mention the brutality, like you said, of nature and of just the way the world works in a lot of ways. There's this. I mean, we were talking before the show. I've grown up in this town that's pretty isolated from everything in a lot of ways. I mean, we're near some cities, but it's we're an hour away from the city, so it's not like the town is nowhere. But the town might as well be nowhere when it comes down to, what I can see. And it's cozy here. It's a nice little town. Nothing serious goes on here. But there's always something going on, right? There's always something in the background. There's always something nasty. You listen to the old folks down at the cafe, and they're like, and they're not, and then you realize, oh, these people are they're kind of not ideal. They're not perfect here. this is a weird. They have weirdness here too. You know,
you get that with a lot of folk horror. One of the tropes is where you get this idyllic setting. Is it Harvest Home? I'm trying to remember which books I've read recently. Harvest Home, and this is killing me now because I can't remember the name of it. But you have this. Oh yeah, it is Harvest Home. I was trying to get that. It's that old Ceremonies by Klein. I was getting those confused. But Harvest Home, he has this idyllic setting, and everything's white picket fences, and it's perfect. And you go behind the scenes, and strange things are happening, and it's not what it seems. And that is quite a standard horror trope where you present a certain image, and then you completely subvert it by what's going on. As you go, out into the open.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it sounds like you've got quite an interesting portfolio. It's great chatting with you, and mostly listening. Honestly, this has been a lot of listening, and that's fine. That's fine. I've just been interested in what you're saying. It's great. Thank you so much for being on the show, Stephanie. Tell people where they can find you. Do you have a website or anything like that? Where can people get your books?
Well, the books, I will say, if you go to Bridget's Gate Press, which have published them, it's www.bridgetsgatepress.com, and they have all the buying links there. Anything that I've published myself, the poetry was self-published, that's all on Amazon. But the details for those are on my own website, which is stephanieellis.org, www.stephanieellis.org. You'll find me there. And I'm on Twitter at lstevie and over at Horror Tree if anyone wants to send me their new book details.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And as for this podcast, you can find us at mentalcellarpublications.com. You can find the books, my books, on Amazon.com. Pretty much all the ebooks are exclusive, but you can also get some very nice, I gotta say, some quite attractive softcover books wherever fine books can be printed on demand. I would say I just updated the covers for the two Twisted Gods books, and I'm very proud of those, actually, even though, don't tell anybody. Oh no, I'm telling everybody. Those covers were mostly made by artificial intelligence. I did all the text and the arrangement, but the actual art is AI generated, so, I'm a cheapskate. Let me put it that way. I also don't have any art skills of my own, but I do know what I like and what I wanted on those covers, so check those out. The first one is The Forgotten Mask, and those are steampunk fantasy with a lot of weird elements. Like all my stuff is weird techno-fantasy elements, so check that stuff out if you're interested in that kind of thing. Got to do the plugs, otherwise I get slapped around by my twin brother. So anyway, thanks for verbally though, people. No actual violence happens anymore. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you again next week. Thank you so much, and have a good week. Bye-bye.
That tears it.